For over a decade, I devoted myself to my father's company, turning it into a $75 million empire. Then, during what was supposed to be a celebration dinner, my father turned to me with a proud smile and said, "It's time for your brother to take the reins." I felt like the ground slipped from beneath me, but I nodded, wearing a mask of calm. The next day at the office, everything felt different. I can still recall the satisfied glint in my father's eye, his fingers resting confidently on my brother's shoulder, as though the decision had always been final. "It's time for your brother to take the reins," he'd said, like I was merely a temporary placeholder. Years of controlling my emotions saved me from reacting, even though I could feel my insides crumbling. The room had been decorated like a gala, laughter, clinking glasses, congratulatory toasts. But beneath the surface, it had been a transition ceremony in disguise. My father had launched Harrison and Company when I was little, a small firm barely surviving in a competitive market. I'd witnessed his sleepless nights, working late nights, sacrificing family vacations, always chasing one more contract to make ends meet. When I was 24, armed with a business degree and relentless drive, I had to persuade him to let me help. I didn't just help, I revolutionized the company, took it nationwide, secured million-dollar deals, implemented technologies our competitors hadn't even heard of yet. The company that once teetered on the edge of collapse had become a dominant force, valued at $75 million. But standing there in that moment, it all felt meaningless. My father had made his choice. Edward would inherit the company, not me. Polite applause and congratulatory whispers circled the room, all for Edward. He dipped his head in mock humility, but it was nothing more than performance. Edward had never cared about the company, not really. He'd bounced between flop after flop for years, never managing to land on solid ground. He yawned at logistics, scoffed at strategy. But the scent of power? That lit him up. I had spent 12 relentless years carving out my place, reshaping Harrison and Company from a crumbling shell into a thriving empire. Every hard decision, every sleepless night, every contract inked, it had all been me. Edward wasn't there for any of it. Yet somehow, this was still happening. Still, I buried every feeling deep down. I'd been taught that weakness had no place in our household. I tightened my grip on the wine glass, willing the tremor to disappear. "Smile, Sophia. Just smile." I raised my glass with the others, my lips forming a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Glasses chimed around the room, none of them seeing the fury simmering in my eyes. My mother's gaze met mine from across the table, unreadable, yet knowing. She had always seen through the performance, but chose silence over confrontation. But she wouldn't step in, she never had. And there sat my father, wearing that familiar, unshakable grin, oblivious to the chain reaction he had just triggered. Across the table, Edward met my gaze, a smug twitch playing at his lips. In that instant, I realized this had never been solely my father's call. Edward had been orchestrating this behind the scenes. He built a persona, the reformed son, full of purpose, full of loyalty. My father, bound by the weight of old beliefs, never paused to doubt what had been decided for him long ago. To him, sons inherited, daughters endured. Their efforts were admirable, perhaps, but always incidental. What neither of them realized was this. While they clung to legacy, I had been building leverage. 12 years of strategy, loyalty, and calculated moves, all mine. And come morning, they'd discover just how much that mattered. I hardly closed my eyes that night. My mind looped through every trade-off I had made. Sleepless nights, skipped celebrations, love lost to endless ambition. I had given it everything. Mind, time, even pieces of my soul. And somehow, they thought I'd go quietly, without a fight, without a word. No, they had no idea who they were dealing with. By 3 a.m., I was at my desk, the room lit only by the cold glow of my screen, hands moving with purpose. I knew every loophole, every clause, every silent clause buried deep in the charter. Harrison and Company was etched into my bones. Edward thought he was walking into a seamless transition. No friction, no resistance. That by next week, the office plaque would bear his name, his power undisputed. What he failed to realize was that while my father focused on handshakes and speeches, and Edward faked his way through board meetings, I had locked down the most important asset, power. At exactly 8:45 a.m., I stepped into the lobby. Same heels, same stride, same unshakable presence I'd worn for the past 12 years. Same glass walls, same glossy floors, same quiet rhythm of the office awakening. But today wasn't like the others. I wasn't heading to just another desk. I was entering a war zone. The front lobby was wrapped in a strange silence, the eerie hush that only comes before upheaval. Word had gotten out. The murmurs were already spreading. My father's announcement from the night before had ignited the rumor mill. Eyes followed me, some curious, some wary, all calculating where to place their loyalty. I ignored their stares. My stride was steady, heels echoing with certainty against the floor. No hesitation, no cracks, not now. I entered my office, my territory shut the door behind me with intention. 15 minutes. That's all I had before my father and Edward arrived, already convinced their thrones were waiting. 15 minutes until their fantasy shattered. I lowered myself into the chair, drawing in a long breath. I powered up my laptop. The display lit up with documents, contracts, and clauses they had dismissed as trivial. I navigated straight to the documents outlining my ownership. I hovered for a beat over the file labeled Executive Stakeholders Contract, then clicked. Then I waited in silence. At precisely 9 a.m., a sharp knock broke the stillness. I stayed silent. The door swung open slowly, revealing my father and Edward, one exuding quiet authority, the other drenched in overconfidence. My father strode in like a king surveying his court. Edward followed, wrapped in a perfectly pressed suit and an arrogant smirk, as if the crown had already been placed on his head. I had to bite back a laugh. "Sophia," my father said in his usual authoritative voice, as if he were doing me a favor by acknowledging me. "I assume you're aware of the transition happening today." Transition. A neat little word to hide betrayal. "I'm well aware," I replied coolly, reclining slightly. I glanced at Edward, his smirk widened, unable to contain his glee. "Excellent," Dad went on, nodding as though everything was proceeding smoothly. "Edward's taking over as CEO. You'll assist with the transition, bring him up to speed before stepping aside." I lifted a brow, feigning confusion. "Step aside? I think you might be mistaken. Dad, I believe you've misunderstood something." His jaw tightened. He was accustomed to my obedience, my quiet agreement. This caught him off guard. "Sophia," he said curtly, tone patronizing, "this is not a discussion. The decision is final." I gave a measured, knowing smile. "I'm aware, Dad," I said gently. "But here's the thing. You're not the one with the final say." Edward let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "Come on, Sophia. Don't turn this into a scene." I stayed silent and picked up the remote, pressing a single button. The office screen flickered to life, displaying a familiar document, the Executive Shareholders Agreement, dated August 17, 2015, signed by Sophia Harrison, James Harrison, and Edward Harrison. My father's skin lost some of its color. I faced Edward. Any idea what you're looking at? He folded his arms, visibly uneasy. A shareholder's contract? He ventured. I gave a slow nod. Correct. Care to guess what's in it? I tapped the monitor, zooming in on a key clause. This was created during the company's restructuring. It states plainly that any executive leadership change, like naming a new CEO, must be approved by all majority shareholders. I locked eyes with my father. And I, Dad, own 60% of Harrison and Company. The silence that followed felt like a vacuum. My father's face grew stiff. No way, Edward said under his breath, moving closer to the screen. Oh, but it is, I replied calmly. While you were tanking one startup after another, and Dad was busy being the corporate figurehead, I was busy with something far more strategic. I leaned in slightly. I was locking in my position. I turned back to face my father. Remember the 2016 expansion? You gave me 15% more shares in return for my financial backing. And in 2020, when we had that legal battle, another 10% was transferred under my name as collateral, which you never bothered reclaiming. Add that to my original 35%, and I became the primary shareholder. My father's jaw tightened. But Edward was unraveling. This is a bluff, he snapped. I slid over another file. Latest filing with the state. Care to double check? Edward grabbed the document and skimmed it, his complexion fading by the second. You can't do this, he faltered. Dad, say something. My father said nothing, because he knew the law was on my side and he had no move left. I rose to my feet with a slow exhale. You're not being fired, Edward, I said. I wouldn't dream of throwing you to the wolves. But you will report directly to me and follow my lead. Otherwise, I nodded toward the door. You're welcome to walk away. Edward looked to our father, desperate. But for the first time ever, Dad had no rescue plan. Nothing to undo it, because the company wasn't his anymore. It was mine now. The air in my office grew thick with silence. Edward held the document like a lifeline, his knuckles white from the strain. My father remained stiff, unreadable. But I could see it. He was already strategizing an escape. But there wasn't one. I had spent years planning for this, not out of paranoia, but because I'd learned, where power lives, loyalty dies. My father looked at me, truly looked, as if seeing a stranger. Maybe he never did. So this is what it comes to? Edward spat, voice sharp with disbelief. You're just taking it all? I let out a low, humorless laugh. Taking? I repeated, walking slowly toward him. Edward, this company stands because of me. Every breakthrough, every milestone, I made it happen. While you stumbled your way up, I kept Harrison and Company breathing. So no, I'm not taking. I'm claiming what's mine. I leaned in slightly, voice steady. I'm not stealing a thing. I'm simply keeping what's always belonged to me. Edward's face contorted in anger, but he had no response. He knew I was right. And worse, my father knew it too. He had spent years believing that family lineage mattered more than skill, that his son would inherit what rightfully belonged to me. He'd written me off for too long, and now the cost had come due. My father finally spoke, voice level but taut. You're making a serious mistake, Sophia. I heard the strain he tried to hide. We're family. Is this really the hill you want to die on? I met his eyes, unblinking. You lit the match the day you made that decision without me, Dad. His mouth drew into a firm line. The company is bigger than you or me. We can still find common ground. I gave a slight nod, feigning thoughtfulness. I completely agree, which is why I'm giving you both two options. I addressed Edward first. You can stay in the company, I said, my tone calm and professional. But you won't be CEO. You'll take an advisory role with limited authority. You'll still be well paid, but you'll report to me. Edward's shoulders stiffened, but I didn't slow down. Or, I went on, you can exit cleanly. I'll acquire your shares at fair market price. You'll leave with a comfortable payout and no involvement moving forward. My father scoffed. You think you hold all the cards? I smiled. I do. The silence that followed was thick. I let them stew in it, let them feel the weight of their own powerlessness. At last, my father let out a breath, his head slowly shaking in quiet disbelief. I didn't expect this from you, he said under his breath. Not against your own blood. His words hit a nerve. Your own blood. I wanted to remind him it was his decision. He had sidelined me, treated me like a placeholder. But I stayed silent, because by now it didn't change a thing. What mattered was protecting what I'd created. They weren't getting it. Not today. Not ever. Edward was the first to leave, slamming the door behind him. Good riddance. I knew exactly what he'd do next. Rally the family circle, spin himself as the betrayed heir. It didn't matter to me. I wasn't fighting for their favor. I was fighting for my future. My father stayed behind for a beat, hoping I'd back down. When I didn't flinch, he finally gave a slow, resigned nod. You're not the same, he murmured. I held his eyes. No, Dad, I just stopped playing a role. Then he turned and walked out. I sank into my chair, releasing the breath I'd been holding. I should have felt like I'd won. I'd stood my ground and claimed it. But the emptiness of the doorway brought with it something else, a quiet, persistent ache. Part of me had always craved my father's validation. A small, stubborn part had believed that if I proved myself endlessly, he'd finally acknowledge me. But the truth was, he never really saw me. And now, he had no option but to see me, not as his child or a placeholder, but as the rightful head of Harrison and Company. I returned to my desk, my mind sharpening into focus. 12 years had gone into building this empire. Now I'd fortify it for the next 12. They came for everything I created, but ended up walking away with nothing. The space I'd ruled for over a decade now felt eerily hollow. No more calls from Dad. No subtle jabs from Edward in email form. Just pure silence. But silence was no comfort. It meant war had begun. I was certain my father wouldn't back down without resistance. And Edward, he'd scratch and scramble for anything he thought he deserved. I knew better than to believe the storm had passed. This was just the opening move. By morning, tension had already started to creep through the hallways. Staff who smiled at me days ago now glanced away, wary of taking sides. Some department heads wouldn't even look me in the eye. I recognized the strategy. Dad and Edward had quietly mobilized their allies. Loyal family members, seasoned boardroom fixtures, trusted insiders. They were sowing distrust, painting me as ruthless and greedy for control. Edward, in particular, had fully embraced the victim role the brother betrayed. I could already imagine him at some lavish bar, nursing a drink while telling anyone who'd listen that I stole the company out from under him. And my father, he'd barely need words. Just a tired sigh, a mournful nod, and the perfect line. I only did what I thought was best. It was a polished attack, and deeply dangerous. If they managed to win over the board and top brass, they could either oust me or cripple my leadership from the inside. I wasn't going to let them get that far. That same afternoon, I ordered an urgent leadership meeting. As I entered the boardroom, the atmosphere was heavy. Some wouldn't meet my eyes. Others stared like hawks, eager for a stumble. I sat down at the head of the table, where I belonged. Let's get straight to the point, I said steadily. I'm aware of the private talks, the whispers, the closed-door meetings. I looked each person in the eye, holding their gaze just long enough to unsettle them. And I know some of you are questioning if I can still lead. Several stiffened in their seats. Silence hung thick. I tapped the table once. Let's settle that right here. I brought up a slide deck behind me. Data, stats, performance metrics. This company went from near collapse to a $75 million force under my watch. Revenues tripled. We expanded into 6 markets in half a decade. I turned to Oliver, our CFO. Tell me, Oliver, do the numbers show even a hint of decline under my leadership? Oliver paused, then responded, not one. Actually, we're projecting 20% growth next quarter. I gave a short nod. Then let's be honest with ourselves. I leaned in slightly. This isn't about poor performance. They're angry because they assumed I'd step down and hand the reins to Edward. Never mind merit. Never mind success. The room stayed still. Then I delivered the real blow. And I'm aware that within the past day, several of you were approached, promised rewards if you pressured me to resign. I raised an eyebrow. If anyone feels like being honest, now would be a good time to speak up. Some squirmed in their chairs. After a tense silence, a senior executive broke it. I got a call, he confessed, from your father. He said he might formally challenge your position. I nodded slightly. And did he promise anything in exchange for your backing? He hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. That confirms it. I sighed and rose from my chair. I respect what my father built, I said. But I'm the one who transformed it, took it beyond what he ever imagined, and I won't let him pull the strings from the sidelines. My tone turned low, steady but sharp. If it's a battle he wants, I'm ready. I picked up my documents, locking eyes with each person. If anyone thinks my father or brother should lead, speak now. Nothing. No one dared. Perfect. I turned and left the room without looking back. This wasn't only about defending my place. It was about making sure they never underestimated me again. That night, I made a strategic call. Not to a director, not to a stakeholder, but to a reporter. By dawn, headlines across every major outlet read, "Power play at Harrison & Co. Sophia Harrison triumphs over family plot." I'd made my move. Now I was watching and waiting. The morning my story went public, my phone and inbox were in meltdown. Dozens of emails, missed calls, texts from reporters, shareholders, board members. Some reached out with support, others treaded carefully. But nearly everyone asked the same thing. Is it real? I didn't answer right away. I knew exactly what my father was up to. He'd spent years mastering the craft of image control. He knew perception could sway power. If he couldn't win behind closed doors, he'd try to ruin me in front of cameras. And that's exactly the war he had started. By midday, the first shot came back, a polished press release, subtle but deceitful. Harrison & Company was built on family principles. We regret recent events but are dedicated to preserving our legacy. As we look ahead, leadership adjustments are part of growth. Outwardly, it sounded civil, but the subtext was unmistakable. Sophia is unstable. Sophia is dangerous. Sophia shouldn't be in charge. I didn't flinch, but rage burned just beneath my calm. I sat at my desk while analysts dissected my leadership on every network. Has Sophia Harrison overreached? Can her go-it-alone approach hold up? Is the company safe in her hands? They spoke as if I were invisible, as if I hadn't already pulled the next lever. If Edward and my father wanted to make this public, fine. I'd take the battle straight to the media. I didn't write a response. I didn't brief the press. Instead, I picked up the phone and called the one reporter I trusted, the one who always knew where to dig. I've got a lead, I told her, and you'll want to move quickly. Within the hour, I forwarded the files, old emails, financial statements, confidential memos. Proof that under my father's leadership, Harrison and Company had operated with shady tactics, the kind I'd spent years fixing behind closed doors. The exposé dropped by the next day. Harrison and Company exposed, a history of debt and deception. The piece was scathing. It applauded the turnaround I led, slammed my father's years of negligence, and made one thing clear. I had been the backbone of Harrison and Company's survival. And just like that, the tide shifted. The board went quiet. Investors backed off. And my father? He had nowhere left to hide. 2 days passed before my father's name lit up on my phone. I let it ring, once, twice, then again, before I finally picked up. "Sophia," he said sharply, "we need a conversation." I leaned back, unfazed. "Do we really?" A pause, then a heavy exhale. "You went too far." I gave a dry chuckle. "You did first." "It was meant to be a legacy," he murmured. "For the family. For you and your brother." A flicker of something old stirred in me. Once, I'd longed for that dream. Not anymore. "If you'd wanted me to protect the legacy, Dad, you should have handed it to me, not tried to rip it away." He hesitated. Then finally, "So, what happens next?" I breathed out, steady. "Now? I've made it so no one can ever threaten what I built again." The battle had ended. My father was defeated. Edward had vanished. And I stood alone as the victor. Yet as I sat behind my desk, eyes on the skyline, victory felt hollow. I felt nothing. Over 12 years, I invested my soul into Harrison and Company, molding it, protecting it, and building it into something indestructible. But success came at a cost I hadn't fully anticipated. In claiming my seat at the top, I hadn't realized what I'd sacrificed, the last pieces of family I had left. The next morning, I walked into the office with the same composed steps. But the energy was different. Everyone could feel it. The rumors had died down. The hesitation was gone. I wasn't just a CEO anymore. I was Sophia Harrison, the woman who outmaneuvered her own family and claimed the crown. Some respected it, others hated it, and a few still waited for me to fail. I let the silence stretch. By noon, my father and I faced each other across the conference table. One last talk. He looked worn, aged, as if everything that had unraveled had finally caught up with him. I said nothing. This time, he had to be the one to speak. When he finally spoke, it was in a voice I barely recognized. Low, subdued. "I'm stepping down," he said flatly. "As of today." I gave no reaction. It was the outcome I'd seen coming. "I'll divest most of my shares," he added. "I'll stay on the books as a minority investor. But that's all." I met his gaze. "What about Edward?" He clenched his jaw. "He's out," he said. "Took the settlement. He's not returning." Deep down, I always knew this was how it would end. Edward was never built for the fight. The moment he realized he'd lost, he did what came naturally. Disappear. Even so, hearing it spoken aloud stirred something inside. Not sorrow, just the weight of finality. I gave a quiet nod. "All right." My father let out a breath, massaging his temple like the weight of it all had caught up to him. Then, after a long, heavy silence, he said something I never thought I'd hear. "I didn't give you enough credit." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was as close as he'd ever come. And oddly enough, I realized I no longer needed one. A month passed, and Harrison and Company had transformed into something unrecognizable. The board members loyal to my father and Edward, replaced. The skeptics in upper management, let go. Harrison and Company had thrived under my direction before, but now it was unquestionably mine. And with full control came the freedom to reshape everything. I launched initiatives my father had once dismissed without a second thought. Modernized systems he once called a waste of time. Ventured into markets he'd always deemed too risky. In just 6 months, our profits skyrocketed. Within a year, we shattered the $100 million ceiling. For the first time, I wasn't fighting for approval. I was building something no one would ever be able to take away. 1 year later, my father and I sat down for dinner. It was the first real conversation we'd had since he stepped down. He seemed changed, calmer. The anger was gone, replaced by a quiet resignation. "Saw the news about your latest acquisition," he said, sipping his drink. "Clever play." I gave a faint smirk. "Of course." A flicker of a smile played at the corners of his mouth. The tension between us had vanished. The battle was over. What remained was the undeniable fact. He had tried to sideline me, and I had shown him exactly why that was a mistake. He raised his glass. "To Harrison and Company," he said quietly. When our glasses touched, I didn't feel bitterness or pride, just calm, because the victory was mine, and I no longer craved his recognition to validate it. Today, as I sit in my office, staring out at the city where I carved out my legacy, I reflect on what this journey has taught me. That sometimes the ones closest to you can be the greatest threat. That loyalty isn't promised, it's transactional. That power isn't handed over, it's seized. But above all, that the most powerful way to prove yourself is not through seeking approval, but by creating something so undeniable that no one can ever look past you again. I carry no regrets. Harrison and Company belongs to me now, and I'll make sure the world never forgets it.